Hi, everyone. This is Tete DePong, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Links in the description. So, hey there, Fortunate Games. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you. So, today we'll be talking to you, and you're currently working on Sam in New York, which is a multimedia project in the form of a visual novel and webtoon comic. And of course, as we have explained to the viewers before, Sam in New York, as we're explaining to anyone who might just be joining us, tells the story of a young man trying to discover his purpose in life as he's torn between his strict parents' desires for him to be a lawyer and his own love of the stage. So you've had a very varied cast of characters that have all been introduced in the procession of Sam's life. And today we're going to be looking at yet another very interesting character who introduces a very fascinating facet to the whole, human experience of, like American assimilation and such. So we are actually going to be taking a look at the character of Tom Melbourne today. Tom is one of the pursuable love interests in the visual novelist Sam in New York, and he is a small town boy from Alaska. So, what can you tell us? Can you tell us more about Tom and his family?
Sure. So, Tom is an outgoing, athletic, and a little bit naive young man from Unalaska, which is a small island in Alaska. Sorry, a small city in Alaska in the Aleutian Islands. He enjoys hunting, fishing, and a lot of sports, including sledding, American football, and others. This is in contrast to Sam and his friends, who grow up in a very urban area. So after graduating from high school as the captain of the football team and valedictorian, Tom got a scholarship to attend the prestigious Ambrose Law School in New York City. Excited that he was given the chance to totally reinvent himself outside with a big O, because Alaskans call other states in the US outside of Alaska outside with a capital O, since there were limited opportunities for young people like him in Unalaska. So Tom was one of the more eager students at Ambrose. He was constantly raising his hand, engaging in debates with the professor, and just basically kind of sticking out all the time. So Sam, when he first meets him, he always thinks of him as the kid that he keeps on seeing at the front, giving lectures, and always engaging with the professor. Tom is actually ethnically mixed. His mother is of primarily English descent, and his father is 3/4 Aleut or Unangan and 1/4 Russian. The original family name was actually Mayakov from the Russian side, and it was later anglicized to Melbourne as a result of the pressures that arose due to the transfer of Alaska from Russia to America in the 1860s. Many Aleuts, and Aleut is actually the name that Russians gave these indigenous people, and Aleuts refer to themselves as Unangan. Aleuts did not anglicize their names, generally speaking, but the Melbourne's ancestor, Tom's paternal grandfather to be exact, chose to do so because he thought it would give them more opportunities as, Alaska was becoming Americanized rather than Russified. He did not want to be confined, or he did not want his descendants to be confined to living life on a distant island in the Aleutian Islands. Tom does have an Aleut name, and it was given to him by his father. His Aleut name is Hakugi, or being above the seashore. A little bit more about Tom's ancestry. So Tom's Russian ancestor was called Innokenty Vladimirovich Mayakov, and he had arrived in the Aleutian Islands in the 19th century. He was a Russian fur trader, or a promyslovok. And basically, Mayakov had arrived to trade furs with the local Aleut people and eventually married an Aleut woman and adopted an Aleut lifestyle. His son, Ilarion Innokentovich, was the one who anglicized the original family name of Mayakov to Melbourne. All of the Mayakovs, or the Melbournes, are pious Orthodox Christians. And this ancestor, Ilarion Innokentovich, he married Ludmila Konstantinovna Lestinkova, an Aleut woman with a deep interest in traditional spirituality. These are Tom's father's parents. So Tom also has a younger brother called Herman, who is very competitive and is also a football player. He studies engineering at another university in New York City. Growing up, Tom and Herman, or Hermie as he calls him, did a lot of activities together, and they're sort of glued together at the hip. They like to explore New York City together, and eventually, Sam has the opportunity to befriend both of them. As I said before, Tom is an Orthodox Christian, although by his generation, he's already not very religious. Aleuts were generally converted to Orthodox Christianity by the Russians, and in the Aleutian Islands, the Orthodox Church was a staple in everyday life. Accordingly, Tom and Herman both have baptismal names, and they're both taken from the Russian Orthodox Church. So Tom, because his full name is Thomas, his baptismal name is Foma, which is the Russian version of Thomas. And for Herman, his baptismal name is the Russified version of his name, which is German, because in Russian, there's no H, so there's a G instead. So German. So if you ever see a name in Russian literature that says German, it's actually Herman, but in Russian.
Right, right. I've seen that. I've seen that, like in different novels and such.
Exactly.
Right. Well, thank you so much for this history of the family, and it introduces a very, like I said, a very interesting aspect that isn't explored a lot, which is, essentially the Alaskan experience and, the sort of, cultural melding and developments of that. Especially when we think that out of all the territories and such, you know Alaska has its own unique flavor and identity, or at least it had at this point, at that point back then. So another question, so now that we know more about Tom and his family, and we have a little bit of insight into Tom's personality as well, how he engages with the university and people and everything else that he approaches, how would you say that Tom contrasts with Sam?
I would say that he contrasts him in many ways. Unlike Sam, who just drifts around aimlessly and wishes he constantly wasn't at law school, Tom studies a lot and he's very active on sports teams and debate teams. He often raises his hand in class and wants to impress the professors there. But at the same time, like Sam, he's also not quite sure what he will do after university. He knows that he will try to pass the New York bar, and if a law firm in New York hires him, he will stay. But if not, he could always go back to Alaska and see if there's any firms that will hire him there after passing the Alaska bar. Even if there's no law firms in Unalaska that could support him, he could always try Anchorage, which is the largest city in Alaska, and he probably thinks there might be more opportunities there if New York isn't willing to take him. So in this way, Tom acts as Sam's foil in many different ways. While Sam is talkative, over the top, and obsessed with theater, and he's not really sure what to do with his life despite being in law school, Tom is generally calm, collected, and focused on academics, athletics, and he doesn't think law school is wasting his time. Unfortunately, Tom does feel like he is a bit naive and sheltered, especially compared to people like Sam, who are very street smart, and a lot of people's dirty jokes and insinuations can fly over Tom's head. He's not really used to dealing with a lot of people at once, and he's also not used to dealing with cunning people or people who are running, a lot of scams and stuff like that. He's just not aware of when this is happening, and he can become quite agitated when he has to deal with a lot of people in one sitting. This is why he doesn't really enjoy going to speakeasies, unlike Sam, who loves being around a lot of people because it allows him to escape his inner demons and also to discover who he really wants to be.
So thank you so much for that. So this is a very interesting development, how Tom is essentially sort of a subtle foil to our Sam. And speaking of this, so essentially Sam's, background and identity have influenced, how he reacts to things, and have, also influenced his personality. How would you say that Tom's ethnic identity, how does that contrast or compare with Sam's ethnic identity, and how would you describe that?
Great question. I would say that Tom, like Sam, also struggles to some extent with his ethnic identity. Tom, he doesn't feel very connected to his father's heritage because he was raised in a more mixed environment, while his father grew up on a distant Aleutian island. There were many islands throughout the Aleutian Islands that were basically very, very small communities. For example, St. Paul only had 300 people, and there was basically just nothing there except for some basic houses, and the biggest building there was the Orthodox Church. And I would say that maybe Tom's father, I haven't quite decided yet, came from such a community, but then later on in his life he decided to leave because there were not that many opportunities there except for fishing and hunting, and he moved to Unalaska, which is the biggest city in the Aleutian Islands. So Tom feels like he's not quite there and not quite here. In spite of his looks, because he looks more like his mother, but at the same time, parts of his face are subtly indigenous, he feels quite connected with some parts of his Aleut roots, since his father had always taken him and his father fishing and hunting on some of the islands. However, Tom cannot speak Aleut besides a few words, since his father's knowledge of Aleut is spotty at best. He is surprised and a bit jealous that Sam is able to speak Yiddish so well, and he really wonders what would have happened if his father learned the language a bit better and passed it down to him better. His father, Fred's mother Ludmilla, was a shamanist who could tell the future, and she had predicted accurately that Herman and Tom would leave Alaska and that they were bound for greatness. Perhaps this is why both of them are so competitive and they will do whatever it makes to quote unquote make it in society. Tom and Fred, while Herman is a skeptic, do have the belief that shamans can see into the future, since the old Aleuts had related that long before the advent of the Russians, the shamans had predicted that white men with strange customs would come to them from beyond the edge of the sea, and that subsequently all Aleuts would become like the new arrivals and live according to their habits. This was accurate, since by the time that Fred was born in the 1880s, many Aleutian customs had already been lost due to the Russian influence, population depletion, intermarriage, conversion to Orthodox Christianity, and other factors. You guys will be seeing in a future short story that Tete has already seen, and it's called Stillness, that will be released as an audiobook as well as in an anthology. Yes, there will be an anthology of Sam in New York related short stories released, and I think most of it can only be seen by Patreons. So basically, you will see a preview of some of the stories on Tapas, but to view the whole thing, you need to be a patron. I will tell you guys more about this as I work on my Patreon and I continue to write the anthology. So in this story, Tom and his family are seen enjoying the outdoors. They create a kayak from scratch, which they take out to sea. There's nothing they like more than kayaking, fishing, and checking out what nature has to offer. In general, the Melbournes are a curious, physically active bunch who want to discover more about the world around them, and this is why Tom and Herman try so hard in New York, because it's part of their journey to learn more about their place in the world and what they can achieve in the world.
This is wonderful. I mean, this is a very moving story, and um, it also explores something that has not been really explored. About the um, you know about this kind of struggle as well with ethnic identity, the dissolvement and fading of a culture. And it's I think there's a wonderful parallel and symbolism between these boys' journey and um, as well as what was predicted about them, and sort of a reflection on how the society had melded and evolved. So how would you say, I believe you may have answered most of this question, but if you would like to elucidate on this, how would you say, how does Tom view himself? I mean, does he view himself um, as really part of the Alouette, slash Anungan, or, does he feel like, because of circumstances being what they are, that he is more, connected to, his mother's side, so to speak?
I would say that he feels like he's more connected a little bit to the Aleut or Unangan side because, the environment he lives in the Aleutian Islands is more tailored towards that. His mother originally wasn't even from Alaska. She was from upstate New York, but then her father moved to Alaska for a job. So then she was there when she was like 13 or so. So she didn't really spend her formative years in New York, for example. But I mean, she wasn't born and raised in Alaska, so it's a little bit different. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, um, Tom feels like he's Alaskan first and foremost, and I think he leans more towards the Nangan identity, but at the same time, he realizes that because there's already this kind of dilution of the culture, he can't fully claim it. Like it's already been
Right.
done, and not even in his generation. So it's different from Joel, who made it him. Like he's of the generation that decides to distance himself from his parents' identity, but Tom wasn't the one who made that decision. It was more like his father or his grandfather who did it, and it gradually became diluted.
Right. So it's more of a external factor that contributed to that, not really a personal voluntary thing.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So this is very interesting, and this really does, show sort of a parallel, but also a contrast with Sam. So I suppose, to sort of go, sort of go off a bit. What does draw, Tom to Sam? Because there's so many differences between them. Is it a thing of opposites attract? Foils, will eventually, fall into each other. And what draws Sam into Tom?
Mm-hmm. These are very good questions, and I will have to explore them more in the future because Tom is pretty much a new character, as you know. I pretty much created him. Well, I mean, I had the concept for him a long time ago, but a lot of these concepts didn't solidify until last week. So there's still a lot of things that need to be thought about. So basically, I would say what draws Tom to Sam at the beginning as friends is that he thinks that Sam is an open person. He notices that most people at Ambrose are pretty much old money, and they come from money, and they come from generational wealth and are basically part of high society. So Tom also falls outside of that because he's from out of states. He's not from high society. He's not like one of those people who go to elite golf clubs or whatever, right? I mean, yes, he's athletic, but not in that way. It's not like those, fencing and all those like expensive hobbies that rich people have. Tom doesn't know anything about that. So he can't really bond with them in that way. And Sam also can. And he really likes how Sam has this kind of sarcastic way of basically giving the middle finger to most people at Ambrose because Sam doesn't agree with their values. And Tom isn't the kind of person to tell people that he doesn't agree with them, but he enjoys how Sam is basically giving everyone the middle finger. So that also draws Tom to Sam. And he also is curious about how Sam knows the city so well. Well, that makes sense because Sam grew up there, but Tom has a lot of difficulties in the big city because there's a lot of places that he doesn't know about and he wants to know about, but no one is willing to tell him about it except for Sam. So he gets a lot of information about, where's the best restaurant, where's Amato's, where's Fine Golds, and all these other like mainstays of the Lower East Side. He gets introduced to through Sam. And yeah, so in a way, a lot of the times, Sam and Tom find themselves together because they both don't fit in with the majority of the students at Ambrose. As hard as Tom tries to fit in by raising his hand all the time and participating in all those mock trials, he doesn't fit in that well, unfortunately, because people don't feel like he has anything in common with them. They feel like he tries too hard, Sam feels like he tries too hard, and it feels like a lot of the time people feel like Tom is unfortunately very fake, and Tom doesn't see himself that way, but a lot of people feel like he feels fake because he tries too hard.
Path that these two are running. And I think it's often in these perpendicular paths that people can find an attraction, a commonality, a confluency that they can sort of agree on. So this is very interesting. So I would say another question that kind of deviates from this Um, what would you say, like, you sort of answered the question, like how their romance essentially will blossom. What would you say? What would you say would really be a pivotal point in securing the fact that they both realize that they're attracted to each other?
I have to think more about that. But the idea I have so far is that Tom is gay and he's always been gay, while Sam doesn't really realize he's bi in certain situations, because in most of the routes where he pursues a woman, he's not going to think about, oh, I might be bi. But like in these situations where he's with Sam, where he's with Tom and Frankie, he actually does question his sexuality more. So I was thinking that Tom has to go through some kind of character arc, which I haven't determined yet. But when he goes through this major character development, I think Sam and Tom will come to realize that they have feelings for each other. And then and then Sam, you as Sam, as the player of the visual novel, will get to choose Tom as a love interest if you feel so. So basically, he has to go through this arc, and Sam has to grow along with him in order for them to realize their feelings. And I'm not really sure what this arc is so far. It might include some external situations, maybe like some sort of thing happens and both of them have to go through it together.
This is a very fascinating development, and I think, yet again, you've shown the brilliance and depth of, Sam's story by not only Sam's own personal journey, but the fact that you are immersing us into the lives of other people that are showing different aspects, things that, very few people, touch on. And, there's interesting, um, symbolism, there's interesting parallel, and all of these are, very wonderful, compelling narratives. And, this is definitely, these are definitely stories and experiences that we need to read about and, kind of experience ourselves as we're reading it and being beside them. Um, so I guess essentially, the next question is kind of an offshoot. What inspired you to create, a character like Tom, with such not an unusual, but, the atypical background?
I think I wanted to basically give another perspective into American assimilation, as you've implied, and basically kind of contrast Sam and Frankie's experiences. Because so far, I mean, even with Katya, because she's also from the Lower East Side, basically all of the characters I have so far who are exploring American assimilation are from the Lower East Side. So I wanted to grab someone who's totally different and, maybe someone who's out of state. So that's how I chose Tom.
That's excellent. That is really excellent. What were some of the difficulties that you had with, developing Tom? Like, was it a matter of finding resources and research, or was it just trying to piece together who he really was?
I would think definitely piecing together who he was. Because for the longest time, I wasn't really sure what kind of role he was going to play. I just knew that he was a try-hard kid that Sam kind of looks down on because he thinks he's trying way too hard. And I'm not really sure where that was going to go.
Right, right. So this is kind of interesting because it shows, I mean, for many creators, not all characters come easy. There's going to be a hard battle fought to get to know that character. But, in the end, the reward is well worth it because we have a very fascinating character in Tom. And, we're all very grateful, to partake, in this narrative he has and this experience because, not only is the significance of what he goes through, something that many people can relate to, um, not just specifically from his cultural and ethnic background, but that can be applied to so many people of various ethnic backgrounds and identities and situations. But also, like you said, giving showing another facet to the American assimilation experience, and it's been wonderful to see how Tom has developed. So, would you say, are there going to be any further developments for Tom, like outside of Finding Sam? I mean, and Sam in New York as well.
Yes. Basically, I think he might even get his own short story because I am thinking of making an anthology of not only short stories, but also an anthology of one-shot comics. And a lot of these will center around characters and viewpoints that are not Sam's. So, that would include Tom. I was thinking of turning Stillness, the short story I previously talked to you guys about, into a short comic. So we will see more about Tom and his family, especially his relationship with his father and the land in Alaska. We will see all of that in the comic as well.
Excellent. I mean, that's wonderful to hear because we certainly, want to see more of Tom and see more of his experiences and who he is as a character, as well. Um, what would you say? What would you say were the some? What were some of the aspects of Tom that you enjoyed the most creating, and what were some of the aspects that you found maybe not as enjoyable creating?
Okay, I would say that the aspect I found least enjoyable is how hard he was to piece together as a person. Like for the longest time, like I said, I first drew the picture of him, the sprite of him back in 2019, the early
Remember that?
2019. And
Yeah.
until now, until like 2 weeks ago, I had no clue who he was. I just knew he was a football player, one of the top students at Ambrose, and basically eventually a love interest for Sam, but I had no clue how this was going to work. And I felt a little bit bad about it because all the other love interests were so well fleshed out. So I'm like, crap, what am I going to do with this guy?
Right, right. Right, and that's something some creators can go through when they have a character. Like there's the gold mine, but how do you dig to it? How do you find out about it? You
Mm-hmm.
know. Um. Oh, sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, what would be some advice that you could give to creators who might be having that trouble with such a character and situation? How would
I
you
would,
tell them that find the character?
yeah, so sorry, my throat is kind of weird tonight. So
Yeah.
like, I think that what advice I would give them is basically to maybe not touch the character for some time. Explore some other themes that you want to explore in the story, and then think about how you want to approach them. And maybe you'll get some ideas about how you can apply those ideas to this character. Maybe you can use this character to build upon those themes you want to explore in the story as a whole.
Right, right. That's a very interesting approach. That's an approach that some writers have done, but it's not really well shared knowledge with many creators. So this is really great advice for all the creators out there.
Mm-hmm. And I know this is kind of funny, but create them in The Sims. I know that it's like a waste of time, and some people have wasted 600 hours on The Sims. But I mean, it is a good idea to maybe make them, because sometimes when you make them in The Sims, you have a clearer idea of how they look, and then maybe make the rest of their family and think, hey, how does this family function? How do they interact with each other? That can actually help you think more about how the character is like.
That's very true. I think that's some very unconventional, but albeit very useful and valuable advice. Go on Sims, people, download it.
And have your sim interact with other characters. You can even
Right.
create the sims of your friends' characters and basically have them interact with your character. So that can also give you more ideas about how your character can be like.
I swear on books. It works. I've seen it happen. I've seen those live streams. It works, people. Try it. um, but yeah, I guess to encapsulate, so we are definitely going to be anticipating more of the developments from Tom. We're very excited to see more of that. Very excited with the potential of Tom and what he's presenting to us and what he would be drawing us into. Would you have any parting words for the audience, like what to expect, or any kind of advice that you would give concerning, like, this journey that you are starting now with Tom?
I would say that in general, if you really are stuck with a character, just leave them alone for now and go on to other characters that you don't have as many problems developing. Then, when you feel more confident about the character that you don't feel confident about, you can go back to him or her or them and basically think a little bit about them. You don't have to think too much about it. Just add a little bit, and piece by piece, I think it will eventually come together.
Right, right. So this is excellent advice, and thank you so much because so many creators just struggle with that and they're banging their head against the table and trying to flesh it out. But like you
Hmm.
said, sometimes it's better to leave it alone, and it'll eventually, grow as you gain more insight. Well,
Hmm.
thank you so much for this advice, and thank you so much for this, marvelous interview. We've learned so much about Tom, and yet another aspect to the experience of Sam's world and the people he encounters, as not only how they affect him, but also on their own as characters. And thank you so much for this marvelous, marvelous interview.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your wonderful questions, Tate.
You're very welcome. And so I guess we can say adieu to our dear audience and conclude this fantastic interview.
All right. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.